Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're gonna make the Omni project, or the basic pieces for that project, meaning the bustier, the waist piece, and the first pair of sleeves that I showed you in my last making of that I posted last week. I'll link it up here as well if you haven't watched it. So I have all of the pieces that I need already prepped and ready to go. Prepped means I have interfacing on my shell, and I added a layer of interlining, which for me is just my mock-up fabric because it's pretty sturdy and tightly woven, so that makes a good interlining as well. But you can use any other, low profile, tightly woven fabric. Denim is also a good option, or any canvas. And I just basted around my pattern pieces with my biggest stitch to make one layer out of these, essentially. And then I also have my lining cut out, which is off to the side. Apart from the bustier, the lining is exactly the same as all of the other pattern pieces. You technically could also use the shell bustier pieces. The only thing that I changed was that I merged some pieces together, so you have less seams, less bulk, less work. So you don't have to use these, you can use the normal pieces as well, because we are going to add the tapes around all of the seams essentially, so there is no reason for us to make, a perfectly finished piece on the inside. Essentially, we are going to finish all of the edges with these connection pieces, so that's why we can use the same pattern pieces for shell and lining. But let's go ahead and start working on this. These are 3 projects in one today. I'm not sure how much I can fit in today's video, but let's get started. I'm gonna start off with the bustier piece. These are the 4 pieces that we need for this. And the first thing that I'm gonna do is sew the front dividing seam together. As you can see here, one is curvier than the other. That means in the one that is less curvy, you need to add some clips into the seam allowance in order for it to open up. Then just match up the bust point, which should be in both pattern pieces. And with that, you can add the stitching line together like this. You can see it opens up very nicely, and you can match everything up. You want to repeat that for the other side as well. I want to cut towards the stitching line here on both pieces, so I am able to iron the seam allowance open. And I also want to add some padding to this top because I want to wear this braless or with or without, whatever I feel like. So I want to have some sort of support. Let's iron this open. I'm using my curved tailor's hand for that. Works best for me. Like that. And now I can go ahead and put right sides of my cup hood on my front pieces, match up the notch with the dividing seam, and of course the center front with the center front in this portion of the bustier, and then also the stitching line here at the side seam. And I can sew this together. I'm gonna iron the seam allowance of my cup hood seam up towards the neckline, because then you're not gonna look into the seam essentially. And here in the center front, I want to cut towards the stitching line, because otherwise you're not going to be able to iron it nicely. And now it's already time to insert some padding. I'm not sure which padding I want to use. This one seems to be quite nice. I'm just going to cut it down a tiny bit because it goes into my seam allowance, which I don't want to have. Like that is better. And I probably need to kind of mold it to the shape of my bustier a bit better. So I'm just gonna pin this in place here, making sure that there's enough space here that it's not in my seam allowance. I'm just gonna fix this in place with some pins, like so. And once I understitch this seam, and I'm also probably gonna stitch left and right of that seam, the cup is in place. So I'm gonna repeat the same for the other side. Okay, let's fix them in place. So with that now done, let's close the side seam and add our back pieces to the bodice, to the bustier, and close it here. I think right here in the side seam, I'm gonna add an invisible boning. So I'm just gonna add it to the side seam allowance. I have this very narrow one, so I'm just gonna cut off a piece which, does not go into the seam allowance itself, as we need to be able to flip that, and sew that onto the side seam on both sides. And the side seam I'm now gonna iron into the back. And that's the bustier already done. You can repeat the same steps with the lining, or if you use the lining pieces, there's just a small little dart that you have to close instead of the kaput seam, and then obviously also the front dividing seam and the side seams. So let's quickly make the lining. And that is the lining done as well. So what I want to do is to prep the back seam for the zipper, because we're gonna make the back seam look pretty with the lining, and everything else will get finished with the connection parts. So I have 2 zippers right here that you can part at the bottom. They're obviously way too long, but I sadly don't have any other zippers in stock right here at the moment. So we're gonna chop them down very drastically to, I don't know, like 7 centimeters, something like that. Obviously we have seam allowance here and here as well, so I need to chop it down to somewhere here so that it sits comfortably. And you want to get your zipper thingy here all the way down so that once you actually cut it, you're not losing your metal piece. And then, go over top here so that this is finished. And then I can safely open and close the zipper. So like that, it safely closes all the way up to the edge. So what I'm gonna do now, I'm gonna add a fold, an ironing fold, to the center back of my shell. And then this piece right here, I want to have it sit so that the teeth are not visible from the outside. So I'm going to push it into the shell piece a teeny tiny bit so that everything is covered. And then I'm only going to pin the zipper band to the seam allowance and not the outside, like so. And once you fold it back, it's not visible. So I'm going to repeat the same for the other side. And of course you want to make sure that it is parallel. And I'm just going to ensure that it is parallel by just, closing it once and checking if everything matches up, which it seems to do. And I can also check whether the placement is correct in terms of hiding the zipper. I think I could go a teeny tiny bit lower on this side. Yeah, I think that's better. Okay, and now I'm gonna loosely stitch this in place here somewhere, it doesn't matter, because we're going to add another one 5 centimeters next to that at the very end as well, so that everything's hidden. So let's attach this to the seam allowance. And now with that done, I can put right sides together of lining and shell and just close the center back seams on both sides and make the center back seam with the zipper look pretty. So for my buttonhole tape, I guess, I am actually going to change up the plan that I had initially a teeny tiny bit. So I used to do 2 layers of my bias binding right here that I glue together, and then I'm going to do a buttonhole with my sewing machine. I think I'm gonna change that up to actually creating buttonholes with seams, or holes in seams essentially. So I'm gonna take one of the 2 pieces, and every 5 centimeters I am gonna have the center of my buttonhole. These are the buttons that I'm gonna be using, and let's say we start here. So I'm just gonna mark the centers of my buttonholes, and I'm gonna see in a second how big the buttonholes need to be. And I measured the neckline of my bustier so that I have more than enough for that section. And I'm gonna repeat the same thing for my empire waist. So these are all the buttonholes. And for this button right here, I guess 1.2 centimeters is all that I need. So I'm gonna mark that all along my piece right here, like so. And now once I put the other tape right on top here, I'm gonna sew up until that point where my buttonhole starts, back tag, start again, do this section, and do all of the in-between sections essentially. And once I iron the seam allowance open, I have buttonholes. Okay, and let's iron this open. And then we have our finished buttonholes. Like that. And now we can test, hopefully it works. So what I also want to do is iron the tape to its final, width. So it's going to be 2 centimeters with seam allowance on it. So we're going to cut that down. And then down here we can probably just double fold it like this and then top stitch so that we also have a fixed and nice finish on the bottom. So let's do that as well. I'm going to cut down 1 centimeter here. I can, just move along that fold line of the bias binding, and then I'm just going to fold this 5 millimeters 2 times and top stitch. Okay, the strip now is ready with the buttonholes. So I'm gonna see which buttonhole is in the center because I want to have one in the center front. This one right here is my center buttonhole. Let's mark that really quickly, and probably also on the wrong side so that you can actually see while you sew. And I'm gonna put that right sides together with my center front and then just work my way towards the center back of my piece. Like that. And once I'm done with that, I'm also going to understitch the seam so that once we iron it towards the inside, everything looks nice and lays nicely. And now let's iron everything towards the wrong side of the bodice. And now there are a few spots where we can actually sew down our piece right here, because obviously it's going to flip up if we don't sew it down. So in between my buttonholes, and I want to be very precise to go in the center, especially here in the center front, I want to fix these in place by stitching into the ditch of any seam that I can, stitch this to. So in this case, it's going to be the kaput seam, and I'm just going to add bar tags right here and right here where I put my needles, because that is the center of that section here. And then other points are obviously the side seams, that's pretty obvious, and on the other side as well. And for our center back, we essentially want to flip this like so, and have this as a neat little end. So I'm going to cut this down. I'm also going to cut down the seam allowance here and have this neatly flipped down. And we still have that last little buttonhole that we might want to access at some point, and we can use this seam right here and also fix this down here in place. And then up here, obviously it's the side seam. And since this section right here is pretty straight, I don't think that we need anything in between there, but you could, if you want to, also, at a few spots do either like bar tags by hand or by machine. We can also use this spot right here for our, I might do this by hand because there is like the padding on the inside, and it's probably not going to look that good if I do it with the machine because it's just going to indent the whole thing. So let's do one by hand here. Okay, that is the bustier. I'm gonna add the same tape to the empire waist as well, and that concludes the bustier. I already put it on. It looks really nice on its own. I mean, it looks kind of like a bikini top, to be honest, but for, like very sunny days, this would be perfect. And it also doesn't fall down, which is super important to me. Nevertheless, I'm gonna add sleeves anyways, but still I want it to be functional in any way. So we can continue now with our waist piece. Okay, so the waist portion of this bodice, I already put it on my dress form. I steamed it and it can cool down in shape. Hope you can see that. So the waist portion basically follows the same principle, the same schematics. So you have a front dividing seam and a side seam. The center back is the zipper. So essentially I'm just going to put right sides together of front and side front, and then I'm going to put right sides together of side front and back, and sew the pieces together and add boning to all of the seams. I'm probably gonna do stitchable boning so you have seams visible, top stitches, but I don't think that that's gonna be bad or anything. And then probably I'll add some additional boning pieces in the front so that you have some structure in the front and then probably also in the back. So let's go ahead and close the seams right here so we have one whole panel for our waist piece. Okay, the waist piece is now complete. Let's iron all of the seams open so that we can add some boning on top of that. Like so. And I'm gonna use some Ridgeline boning as per usual. This one right here. And I'm just gonna add that to the wrong side of my fabric here and here. And also make sure here to leave the seam allowance without boning. So always cut the boning so that it does not go into the seam allowance, as you can see here. Probably want to do it even a little bit shorter just to be sure, like so. And I'm gonna pop these in next to all seams, and then probably I'll do one in the center and here in the center of the back panel. Okay, I have my lining and shell now done. So for the zipper, I'm gonna do the same thing that I did for the bustier. So I'm gonna iron the seam allowance, and then I'm gonna put the zipper so that it is not visible from the ironed fold side. And now I can base this onto the waist piece. Let's go ahead and add the lining. I'm also gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna put right sides together at the center back, and so here and here. So to get a nice edge on the bottom of the button tape, I'm going to cut some strips of the bias binding that are about the length of our empire waist, a tiny bit bigger, so that you have a little bit of wiggle room. And I'm gonna iron them open like so, both of them. And then I'm gonna put the right sides together and actually close one of the sides so that I have a neat finish once I iron them again. So let's do that quickly. I'm now gonna iron that to one side, doesn't matter which one, and then fold it again one more time so that I have one clean edge that will be visible on the inside only. And it's leaving me with 1 centimeter seam allowance, which I'm going to use to just put them right sides together with the top. And all of that will be put in between the lining and the shell. The bottom will be finished the same way as we did the buttonhole tape in the bustier. So let's put right sides together only with the shell, not with the lining. Let's put that aside. I also made sure to fold right sides together here at the fold line for the zipper, so that once this is folded upwards, you know, you have a clean edge. I did that on both sides, pre-measured obviously, and then sewed it on. Now we can fold the lining over top here. Just be careful with the center back because we have that little overlap. I like to just fold everything how it's gonna get folded and then add a pin right here so that once you flip it, you have the edge like perfectly folded already here. So let's do that here again. Lining out of the way, fold line in place, and now this gets folded downwards and the lining over top here, however it's gonna, you know, lay in the very end like so. And then I'm just gonna add a pin right in here and pop out that edge so that I know how to sew my lining on. And then I can just match up the in-between. I want to match up all of the seams, of course, and the center and everything, and I can sew the lining on here as well. I want to cut down the edge right here, same to this side, and now I can flip everything right sides out. So you want to have this line right here merge into the center back that is folded over top of your zipper. I'm going to show you for the other side again. Let's just take this edge out here, and there you can see that there is the fold line, so you can kind of wiggle this back in there. And it also wants to lay that way, so as we prepped the lining beforehand, that's why we did it how we did it. You can see now that all of this lays how it's supposed to lay. in one continuous line. We can give this whole thing an iron, and that's what it looks like on the inside and on the outside. And I think that works out really nicely. So let's go ahead and iron the rest of our Empire waist. And now I'm gonna go ahead and also top stitch at 1 centimeter here. I think I want to top stitch right here at 5 millimeters as well, here at the Empire waist, because I feel like it looks better and it has more strength. But you can do the 1 centimeter stitch here, and we can base the bottom, the waistline, together as well. You also want to transfer the placements of the buttonholes to the button tape as well. So I just laid down my bustier and transferred the points. What I did though, and you want to do that as well because it just keeps it together better, and it's also done like that for like button tapes and shirts and stuff in the industry. You want to not perfectly center all of your buttons. You want to have them slightly moved to the right and left, you know, on either side. Just interchange them by 1 millimeter or something like that. Because then everything just sits a tiny bit tighter, or not tighter, but the bond is just a bit stronger. So for me, for example, I did the center one in the center because that's important. Then right here, I pushed it a tiny bit to the right, and here I also pushed it a tiny bit to the right. This one is a tiny bit to the left. And yeah, that's the connection for the Empire waist. Let's get the waistline done as well, same as here. So I'm also just gonna do exactly the same thing, and then all the in-between seams right here get like a bar tag or a stitch in the ditch, so you can't really see it on the outside, but you want to have these stoppers basically, otherwise the thing would just flop down and you want to prevent that. So I have some bar tags here and there, and then for all the seams I went in the ditch so that everything stays where it's supposed to. And with that, the waist piece is also done. Okay, this is the finished bodice. I already put it together here and it looks really, really nice. I also already tried it on. It's very sturdy, it's very nice, super, super pleased with that. So let's continue with the sleeves. I have everything prepped here. I'm gonna do some organza sleeves with this beautiful emerald green. Can't really see it on camera, but it is actually a very, very true green. It looks very bluish green here on camera. Anyways, I'm gonna do the sleeves out of this material here, and then the arm's eye and the cuffs will be the same pattern, same fabric as the bodice. So let's start with our arm's eye. So I have a set of lining and then also shell pieces, and I'm gonna do the same for these two. So I'm going to show you with the shell pieces. I'm going to put right sides together of the shoulder seam and close it right here. Same thing on the other side, and then also on the lining. I'm going to iron the seam allowance here open. So let's do that. In the back, I want to have a tie which sits right at the notch. This right here is the back. So I want to have right here a tie, and I'm thinking about what kind of tie I want. I could do the bias binding. I could also make one out of the shell. I think I'm gonna do the bias binding out of the shell. And I am going to use a piece of thread that is strong enough to, you know, not rip on me. And essentially what I'm gonna do is put the thread in the center here, just gonna bar tack it in place, and then cut like this shape and fold it in half so that it lays on the inside, stitch, and then you can pull it out. Okay, I managed to make them very small and also round. You achieve the roundness if you just don't cut down the seam allowance on the inside so it bulges up and it makes the strings round. And then I also did like a lot of teeny tiny top stitches here at the bottom and, you know, fix it in place like that. And I can now put these, I have a notch right there where I want them. So I'm gonna put them right here, right on top of that notch. It's probably not the worst idea to also pin them in place. I'm just thinking right now, because right here there's gonna be the button tape, and I guess it would be better to start off with the button tape. So we can leave the tie where it is. We can actually also bar tack it in place so that it is fixed here. But I want to start with closing the side seam right here, also in the lining, so that we can then add the buttons to this whole thing. So let's close the side seams. Let's iron the side seams open. And let's prep the button tape. So I'm gonna measure again the distance that we need and a bit more, like that. Cut off twice. And as I said before, you wanna iron these open, and then to get a neat edge on both sides, you wanna put right sides together and close one side. And now we want to measure how much we need of this button tape, because we still have the two sides open and we want to finish both of these sides. So I am going to finish one side. I'm just gonna sew right here, and then we're gonna measure how much we need for the other side. And let's turn this right sides out. And now we can use this to measure how much we need to cut off. So right here, I'm just gonna mark it. This is my edge, and I need 1 centimeter less of that. So once I flip this, I know exactly where to stitch, which is exactly here. And now with that prepped, we can pin both the button tape and also the lining on top of our shell here. And now you can stitch the neckline close along here. Okay, that is what it looks like. So let's iron this nicely as well. Like that. And with that done, we can just flip this right sides together as well and sew along the neckline. So we're gonna leave the arm's eye as is open, because we're gonna sew that together with our sleeve in the very end. So this is gonna get sewn together here, match up the shoulder seam, and then of course everything in between. And then we're also going to sew the tie in place here. So also pin that like so. Let's clip away the edges right here so we can turn everything over a little bit easier. And we can use the arm's eye to turn everything right sides out. And now we can iron so that the ditch of the seam is only visible on the lining side as usual. Like so. That is one side, and then I can also go around the arm's eye and baste the two layers together. Okay, let's continue actually with the sleeve. And what we need to do for that is to close the side seams. I'm gonna do a French seam because this is sheer fabric. So I'm gonna put wrong sides together at the side seam and sew at probably like 3 millimeters, because I only have 1 centimeter seam allowance. So very closely to that edge. And I'm gonna flip it and stitch again so that I encase my raw edge into my seam. Gonna repeat the same for this side. So for the slit, I want to turn everything wrong sides out, because now I'm gonna put right sides of my slit facing, which is just a piece that is 3 centimeters wide. I'm gonna put right sides onto the wrong side of the slit. And my seam allowance at the slit is 5 millimeters from the start, and we're gonna move to 1 millimeter at the tip of the slit, because actually there is no seam allowance on the slit because we just cut into the piece itself. So there is technically no seam allowance here, but we're just gonna make ourselves a little bit of seam allowance by just going down to 1 millimeter here. I'm gonna put a needle into the tip so that I know exactly here. And then I'm gonna go back to 5 millimeters pretty quickly so that I can finish the slit. And with my sewing machine, I'm gonna stay at 5 millimeters throughout the whole slit, because I already prepped the tip right here at 1 millimeter. So right here where the needle goes into my piece is where I want to stitch. So just sew at 5 millimeters throughout. This doesn't really iron that well, but I'm gonna try nevertheless. I wanna iron the seam allowance into my slit facing as careful as I can, like so. And then I wanna fold 5 millimeters in and then 5 millimeters again so that I cover the stitching line that I just did. And I'm gonna pin that in place. Same here. And I want to be sure to cover the stitching line completely with my tape right here. Like so. Let's pin this in place. And now you want to stitch very closely to that fold line right here and fix the slit in place. That's what it looks like. And once you fold this down to close the slit, you're gonna find that your slit facing lays like this. And here is where you wanna add a small little diagonal bar tag so that once you actually wear the garment, it lays nice and you have everything perfectly in place. So let's go ahead and add that as well. And now we're gonna iron the slit so that you can go into your slit from the front. Meaning, here is the back because here is the smaller portion. So we're gonna fold the slit facing towards the inside where the back sleeve is. And the other side just gets ironed flat. And you can also cut down the slit facing here and here. And now once we add the cuff, this will lay like so. With that done, we can go ahead and gather the sleeve hem so that we can then put it onto our cuffs. So for the cuffs, I have 2 layers. I have the shell and then obviously also the lining. So I'm just gonna put right sides together of shell and lining and stitch around the 3 sides that are gonna be sewn together. This side up here, we're gonna put together with the hem of the sleeves. I am going to prep my shell by ironing the seam allowance into the piece onto the wrong side. That's just gonna make it easier once we actually put everything together. And now let's put these layers together and stitch the 3 sides. Let's cut away the seam allowance towards the edges and turn everything right sides out. And let's iron the ditch of the seam towards the lining. You can choose if you want to later, once the cuffs are on the sleeves, to top stitch them. I wouldn't advise to do that right now because we still need to, sew them on. But afterwards you can do however you want. I'm not sure if I'm gonna top stitch at all, but I'll see about that. As you can see, the sleeves are at the moment double the size that they need to be. So we need to gather the sleeve hem down to fit the cuffs. So let's add some gathering stitches into the hem of the sleeves. So I'm gonna arrange all of the gathers so that they're almost like that they're as even as I could get them. And then once I have that, I am going to put the wrong side of my cuff together with the wrong side of my sleeve and sew that. So once I flip it, I have the pre-ironed fold going on top and everything looks neat and tidy. So let's go ahead and sew that. I also added some gathering stitches into my sleeve head right here from the front to the back gathering notches. You're going to find the notches in the pattern pieces. So I'm just going to put right sides of my sleeve shoulder notch together with my shoulder seam. I have a notch in here. And then same thing to the side seam and the gathering notches. Okay, and with the lower portion now in place, I'm going to go ahead and gather. So I'm gonna grab both of my bobbin threads and gather this whole piece so that it fits into my arm's eye. It's probably not that much that you need to gather. You can see it's already enough for me here, or maybe not. Let's do a little bit more. Let's just distribute these nicely, add a few more pins, and then we can go ahead and sew the sleeves in. To transfer the buttonholes, again, I'm gonna just lay the piece on here and then just mark wherever there is a buttonhole, just like that, as easy as that. And here, on the other side, obviously, I'm gonna add the buttons. On the cuffs, you want to add buttonholes and buttons as well. So right here where it's folded, that's the overlay. So you want to add the buttonholes to that side. And here where there is no fold, the slit is straight, you want to add the buttons. And that's it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'm super excited to put the piece on and see what I can make out of it in the future. So very excited about that. If you haven't already, please go ahead and subscribe to my channel and ring the bell so you'll get notified every time that I post. I post on Sundays, so you can keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, if you haven't already, please go and support me over on my socials. I post short format content all around my patterns and my projects every week. So if you're interested in that, check out all of the links in the description box down below. Also down there is the most direct way to support me, which is to head over to my Etsy store, where you can also find that pattern and all the other patterns that I am doing here on my channel. I bet there is something out there that you want to make for yourself. So please, please, please go ahead and check that out as well. And a special thank you to all of my channel members. You can get exclusive benefits through the link in the description down below. So thank you so much for watching, and I'm gonna see you next Sunday. Bye guys!